Have you ever wondered what were the grounds for examining someone as a witch? Why would they interrogate or examine somebody who was accused of being a witch? Well, English Puritan theologian William Perkins literally wrote the book on the identification of witches. His writings established standards for witchcraft evidence and distinguished between bewitchment and demonic possession. And we know his criteria for examining an alleged witch were used in New England in at least some cases because Boston ministers cited him in their June 1692 advice to the Salem court. This was the return of several ministers when Governor William Phips of Massachusetts had asked for advice on how to proceed with the Salem Witch Trials. This is some of what they got. And Connecticut magistrates also invoked his standards in 1693 to justify reprieving Mercy Disborough, arguing the evidence against her fell short of what Perkins required for conviction. And Connecticut Deputy Governor William Jones used a document with an abridged version of this criteria during this case. Welcome to Salem Witch Trials Daily. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
Hi, I'm Sarah Jack. Perkins laid out the 7 grounds for the examination of a witch in his book titled A Discourse of the Damned Art of Witchcraft.
First criteria is if you were notoriously defamed by the public for a witch, which just meant if you had the reputation of a witch, then it was time to bring you before a magistrate and examine you.
If an individual became an accused witch because a confessed witch accused them.
And another one was if after cursing there follows death or even mischief. So this is if you say something like, you go to the devil, and then the next day that person falls sick. That's the mischief that happens, and you can be examined for witchcraft.
If after enmity, threatening, or quarreling, mischief follows.
I find those two to be very similar, the cursing and the threatening and quarreling. But this just means that you don't have to actually utter a curse to somebody. Just having an argument with somebody and then something happens to their livestock 3 weeks later, that's enough for you to be examined as a witch.
Association with alleged witches.
Yeah, if you were a family or a friend of somebody who was a confessed witch or a convicted witch or just accused themselves, then you could be brought forth and examined.
If someone was identified as having a witch mark or witches' marks on their body, that was grounds for examination.
And if inconsistent or contradictory answers are given, which confuses me, this one, because who are they giving these contradictory answers to if they haven't been examined yet? But after somebody meets these criteria, they do get examined, which is an interrogation and a physical examination to find the witch marks. And so once they're examined, then they can be indicted and then tried. And when they're brought up for trial, there's certain new criteria for actually proving that they're a witch. Everything that we've talked about before was enough to establish suspicion, but this is actually how you find them guilty.
Perkins' A Discourse of the Damned Art of Witchcraft also gave a list of insufficient proofs for conviction.
One of these really blows my mind. This first one, he says that this happened in the olden days, which this is published in 1608. So the olden times were really old by our standards. But anyways, in these old days, they would force the suspected witch to hold a red hot iron or put their hand in boiling water. And if they could bring their hand out unscathed or release the iron unscathed, they were innocent. But if they were burned or scalded, like I suspect that most people would be, burned or scalded by holding a red hot iron. I don't know if you've ever accidentally touched an iron when it's hot, it burns. So, but if they burned, they were guilty.
This is a test that's used today in witchcraft accusations in some communities.
Yes.
Yeah.
Another of Perkins's criteria that was insufficient was the scratching of the suspected party and the present recovery thereupon, which means that if you believed that you were afflicted or bewitched and you scratched the person you thought was the witch, drawing blood from them, this was the belief that that action would actually help you to get better.
So that was not sufficient.
That's not sufficient. Another of these insufficient proofs was burning an object that was bewitched or a piece of a person or animal that was bewitched. So it might be taking some hair and burning it, or it might be taking some fingernails and toenails, putting them in a witch bottle and boiling that. But this was supposed to cause some kind of injury to the witch. And so they would be discovered by having this injury.
And he specifically outlines an insufficient proof of don't burn a part of the party's house. So burning a piece of their thatched roof or wall or door was not a proof.
Not a proof, but a good way to get them out of the house. Then another one, the last of these proofs that were insufficient, was actually the swimming test, which we know was used in Connecticut. This, of course, you bind somebody's wrists and ankles and put them into some water and see if they float or not. If they float, they're guilty. If they sink, they're innocent. But then you've got to pull them out real fast.
Hey, I was just thinking about the magistrates burning things in the court. That is kind of pushing the envelope here, because Perkins' book's quoted as saying all these proofs are so far from being sufficient that some of them, if not all, are after a sort practices of witchcraft. And we, in our podcasting, we constantly point out when the authorities were using folk magic to try to determine witchcraft. And Perkins right here is saying, don't do that. But he also, his proofs are also nonsense. So there's no authority.
Yeah. His evidence so far has been BS. He gave the true proofs of witchcraft that were necessary for conviction. The first and key one being a free and voluntary confession, a confession after due examination. And that examination must have been taken upon pregnant presumptions. So you had to have some kind of evidence in mind to examine the person and get this free and voluntary confession.
And this is on conviction, not just on grounds for examination. This is the conviction of a witch.
This is at trial. You want to have this confession in hand to get the conviction.
Evidence that the defendant entertained a familiar spirit. And I know they used this against Margaret Jones, who was the first person executed in Massachusetts for witchcraft.
And Matthew Hopkins used this in his East Anglia witch hunt during the English Civil War. He's the self-styled witchfinder general, and he implemented this method that was then used on Margaret Jones called watching, where you would sit the person in the center of a room and you'd have observers watching them around the clock, keeping them awake, just to see if a familiar spirit would run in and feed from their witch's mark or teat. And then you had them. And the last proof that would get you a conviction was if witnesses testified under oath that they observed basically strange actions of the defendant, like using special powers or witchcraft, that these kinds of actions would prove that the defendant entered into a covenant with Satan. And we know that the covenant with Satan played a role in the Salem Witch Trials. We talk a lot about signing the devil's book. a lot of people were indicted for covenanting and convicted for covenanting in addition to afflicting people.